congratulate Strike Map for republishing William Zebulon Foster's A Manual of Industrial Unionism. You always wondered what the Z stood for. I don't know where Zebulon comes from. I think it might be Old Testament. So this is a particularly timely republication. When in Britain we've just come through the largest strike wave for 35 years, which posed many political and industrial questions for trade unionists. Not least of which was why aggregate membership of trade unions in Britain fell in 2022, the last year for which figures have been produced, especially amongst women workers in the private sector, during a period of not quite unparalleled, but a period of extraordinary industrial militancy. And I think the data on the reasons for workers leaving trade union membership is too ephemeral and poorly researched at this stage to come to definitive conclusions as to why trade union membership levels were falling while trade unionists were out on the streets, on picket lines, marching, and all the rest of it. Some comrades have pointed to the failure of trade unions to take up struggles sufficiently for low-paid women workers, but I think it may simply be an expression of what you might call trade union consumerism. The idea that in straitened circumstances, with prices rising, austerity, wages falling, workers look through their direct debits for something to save money on. They get rid of Netflix, and then they get rid of that monthly payment that goes to a union that they don't have a particularly close relationship with. So I think we need to draw the correct conclusions from this. And one of them, I think, is the organising model, which has been talked about in Britain and was imported from the United States in the 1990s. The organising model, as it's been reproduced to us in this period, is a pale echo of the model which William Z. Foster and his contemporaries were talking about when they founded industrial unions in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s. And what's clear is that if we're going to build our unions in Britain, we're going to have to challenge the power and inequality of capitalism in the workplace and in the employment, which is embedded in the employment relationship. And to do this, we need to learn from our history. And William Z. Foster's Manual of Industrial Unionism is, as it says, an instruction manual that helps us to do that. I want to just make a couple of statistical comparisons between where we are now and what the US labour movement was doing in the 1930s. And it didn't start in the 1930s, but it took off in the 1930s. US labour unions grew faster between 1933 and 1953 than in any other period in their history. The unionisation rate, that is the share of non-agricultural workers belonging to unions, in 1928 was 9.9% of the employment market. By 1939, before the US had even entered the Second World War, it had doubled to 20.7% in 6 years. By 1947, the beginning of the Cold War, it had reached 31.4%. That's the peak rate of unionisation in the United States, and it's all been downhill from there. So we need to look at why that happened, how it happened, what were the material circumstances that allowed it to happen, and we need to draw the correct lessons from that, because, of course, we're not living in the United States in the 1930s. Our society, the economy that we live in, is very, very different from that. The government that we have now, although it uses some of the language of the New Deal, it talks about a New Deal for working people, is not proposing a New Deal. And we need to understand what the New Deal administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually was. And we need to understand what we need to be doing in terms of empowering and organising the working class in our own society. So I'm going to just rattle through a couple of points that I think are important from the pamphlet, because I don't think you can just read it without understanding the historical context in which it was written. So the first thing is that this pamphlet comes out in 1937. It's written by Foster, I think, when he's still in Moscow. He went to Moscow. He wrote it when he came back from Moscow, but he went to Moscow in 1932, having suffered a heart attack on the presidential campaign trail. He was standing as the communist candidate for the Communist Party USA for president, and he suffered a heart attack. Went to the Soviet Union for recuperation, stayed there for 3 years, wrote this pamphlet, and came back as the New Deal administration was taking shape. And as he says in the first part of his pamphlet, unions are organs of struggle, and the most effective organs of struggle are organised on an industrial basis. This particular part of history is important because what we saw after the Wall Street crash was that US capital attempted to reorganise itself, and the New Deal administration was setting up industrial cartels. It was an attempt to break the power of Wall Street, which had failed so disastrously in the Wall Street crash, and to re-establish a floor for prices, wages, and to fix supply targets for industry, because commodity production had collapsed in the United States. Homelessness was at 2 million in the United States. Joblessness, unemployment was rampant, and society was on the verge of collapse, and a political revolution was in the air. And the FDR administration, the New Deal administration, one of its first acts was to bring about something called the National Industrial Recovery Act, which forced capitalists, industrial capitalists, to establish codes of fair competition by fixing sectoral prices and wages, and establishing production targets, restricting competition in industrial sectors, and building industrial cartels. And this was handed massive power in the United States economy to industrial capitalists, which previously they had to share with finance capitalists and the banking sector, particularly in Wall Street. These guaranteed profits that came out of these cartels allowed the monopolies to employ more workers, so addressing the twin social crises of unemployment and homelessness. Monopolies had to accept, in return, codes, one of which was compliance with Section 7A of the National Recovery Administration Act, which granted workers in each industry the right to bargain collectively with representatives of their own choosing. So trade unionism, or labour unionism, was built into the recovery model that capitalism went for in the 1930s in the United States. And this new legislative dispensation immediately boosted labour organisation in large industrial plants, which had been completely immune to the extremely arduous and hard-fought attempt to organise the steel industry, the rubber industry, pharmaceuticals, electrical industries. All the new emerging industries in the United States had been impervious to industrial organisation throughout the 1910s and 20s and through to the 1930s. It was only with the New Deal that the nut was cracked and unions got in there and were able to sweep up the hundreds of thousands of workers into trade unions to act in a militant way. There was no trace of social partnership. There was no trace of labour quietism in this project. It was a militant project of organising workers where they had the legal backing of the National Labour Relations Board to do so. I think I want to say a couple of words about Foster's personal biographical background, because I think it's very important. His life, as I think I said in the introduction, it's like something out of a Woody Guthrie song. It's absolutely incredible. He left school at age 10 in 1891. He worked as a die sinker, then in a lead factory, a fertilizer plant, in sawmills, railways, lumber yards, a streetcar worker, a longshoreman, a seaman. He joined the Socialist Party, Eugene Debs's party, in 1901, and in 1909, he joined the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, from prison in Spokane, where he'd gone as part of the IWW's free speech call. They were holding street meetings in the street in Spokane, getting locked up for holding union meetings. And so they called on fellow Wobblies to come from all over the United States and just hold meetings in the street and get locked up with them. Well, the jails in Spokane were rammed so full of industrial unionists that one guy who'd been imprisoned during the American Civil War recorded that the conditions were worse than when he was imprisoned by the Confederate Army. It was really foul. He got out of Spokane. In 1910, he crossed the Atlantic, went to France to learn about industrial unionism from the syndicalist movement in France. He went to the CGT's Congress in Toulouse in 1910. 1910 was also the year of the first French national railway strike. He was deeply affected by what he learned from the CGT, and he picked up a number of terms that are synonymous with French syndicalism, including the idea of a militant minority who go into a reformist union in order to build a progressive and revolutionary base within the union and to win it for revolutionary workers. He returns back to the United States 2 years later, where he founded the Syndicalist League of North America, which included Earl Browder, later Communist Party chair, president, leader of the Communist Party USA, and James B. Cannon as members. And he became a railway worker. He became an organizer for the Brotherhood of Railway Carmen in Chicago, and he was chosen by the Chicago Labor Federation for a project to organize the stockyard workers. That is to say that the meat packers and all the workers across the stockyards. This became a kind of key project. Are you waiting for me to shut up?
I'm not waiting for you to shut up. I'm enjoying what you're saying.
Pass me a note saying shut up. A couple more minutes. So the Stockyards Labour Council in Chicago was a innovative, brilliant organisational venture, which for the first time organised workers across race lines. A very large proportion of the workers in the stockyards were black African American workers from the South who'd migrated to Chicago after the ending of the slave regime in the South. He was able to organise them into unions despite the deep racial divisions and prejudices that existed, and they managed to win a key battle over wages, which they balloted for strike action and received essentially, the government intervened. This was by this stage in the middle of the First World War. American meat production was essential to the First World War. You can imagine in Europe, peasant populations had been recruited into the army. There was huge importations of grain and meat coming from across the Atlantic, and Chicago was the centre point, the nodal point for all of this. Their organising breakthrough essentially utilised the labour shortage and the World War I trade boom to leverage the US President Wilson to force employers to arbitrate on wages, hours of work, and union recognition. This was a sort of temporary victory, which was soon revoked after the First World War ended, and most of the labour organisers were then sacked. Foster was then chosen as a delegate to the AFL convention in 1918. And at that convention, they put into work on building a national committee for organising iron and steel workers. The steel industry in America had remained impervious to union organisation throughout the early 20th century. And in an incredible piece of organisation, he put together a team of around 220 organisers, 60 or so of whom he picked from the Communist Party, who led an organising drive across the steel towns in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and won a massive vote for strike action. They were met with unparalleled state brutality, a total clampdown. In fact, there was a congressional inquiry launched into William Z. Foster as a result of his activities. Gary, Indiana, a big steel town, was put under martial law. 11 strikers were shot. It was a major military effort to suppress this organising drive. By this point, he'd become quite notorious. He'd been blacklisted by rail companies. He was becoming unpopular in the AFL amongst the leadership because of his clearer and clearer allegiance with the Communist International. He went to Moscow at the founding conference of the Red International of Labour Unions in 1920 and came back and became their agent in the United States. He set up the Trade Union Education League as a vehicle to spread the ideas of Marxism, Leninism amongst trade unionists, and he continued to preach the idea of what we would call, or what has been called, boring from within. It's a terrible phrase. But he opposed the tactic of the IWW, which was this idea of dual unionism, setting up a revolutionary union to compete with existing unions. He believed in getting in, getting your hands dirty, fighting with the bureaucrats, taking the arguments into the mass organisations of the workers. I'll try and come to a conclusion at this point. So the Trade Union Education League and its successor organisation, the Trade Union Unity League, were incredibly important as trade union organising, as labour union organising ventures. There are some really key points about them that come out when you read about his life and read some of the literature that they produced. One is their identification of a question of class and race and sex as being interlinked, and in particular, in America, the case of race. In the 1920s, late 1920s, US capitalists were trying to move production back to the southern states where there was cheap labour and high unemployment. And they also had Ku Klux Klan terror gangs that could intimidate the local population and union organisations. Foster wrote, in its organisation campaigns, the Trade Union Unity League lays special stress on the organisation of Negro workers, his words, who are playing an increasingly important role in the steel, coal, mining, meatpacking, railroads, and many other basic industries. To facilitate this work, the Trade Union Unity League sets up interracial committees in the various localities it organises. In the various localities. It organises Negroes into the new industrial unions with the white workers on the basis of the fullest equality. In the old unions, it combats all discriminatory practices aimed against the Negroes. It demands the admission of Negroes into these unions without discrimination, and where this admittance cannot be accomplished and there are no new unions, it organises separate unions for Negroes. So they put the question of race and racism absolutely at the centre of their organising drive in the South, in the American South, and elsewhere as well. That organising drive that they went on in the 1930s coincided with an attempt by some of the AFL unions to form an industrial organisation in the early 1930s in response to the New Deal. And when those two forces came together in the Congress of Industrial Organisations, they provided the biggest organising boost for American workers in their entire history. This booklet is a really brilliant description of how to do it. It's a how-to manual. I advise anyone who reads it and is excited by it to go and read about the history of the era. There's a bibliography that I've got up here with some really good background reading books about the history of the US labour movement, which can give you further reading material. But I'm really proud to be here tonight and to have contributed an introduction to what is a great piece of working class literature.